America did not lose control of its housing market overnight. It priced itself out of control.
Canada's lumber industry having to deal with the pain of tariff on tariff. A 10% hike on an existing 35% tariff, plus a brand new 25% tax on finished wood products.
When Donald Trump said the United States did not need Canadian lumber, it sounded like strength. It sounded like independence. It sounded like control. It was none of those things. Because modern economies do not run on what a country has. They run on what a country depends on. And in this case, the United States was not in control of the system it was trying to reshape. It was inside it. And when Washington pulled on that system, the system pulled back. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how a 34% tariff became a gift to Canada. The tariffs arrived with confidence. Duties on Canadian softwood lumber climbed as high as 34%, which piling new costs onto a trade relationship that had quietly underpinned American construction for decades. The announcement was framed as a correction, a reassertion of domestic strength, a signal that the United States would no longer subsidize foreign producers at the expense of its own workers. The political logic was clean. The system did not agree. To understand why that one decision carried so much weight, you have to understand what Canadian lumber actually does inside the American economy. The United States consumes more softwood lumber than any other nation on Earth. Framing a single-family home requires roughly 15,000 board feet of lumber on average. Multiply that by the more than 1 million homes that American builders complete in a typical year, and you begin to see the scale of what was at stake. For decades, Canadian softwood lumber drawn from the vast boreal forests of British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec has filled roughly 30% of that demand. It arrives reliably. It meets grading standards that American builders trust. And it arrives at prices that domestic mills have consistently struggled to match. That 30% is not supplied. It is controlled. Because the country that fills the gap in your system is the country that shapes your options. Washington saw dependency. Ottawa saw leverage. Only one of them was correct. The political framing from Washington was that domestic producers would step in and fill the void. American sawmills would hire more workers, ramp up production, and reclaim market share that had drifted north over generations. On paper, the argument had surface plausibility. The United States has forests. It has sawmills. It has workers who know how to run them. What the argument missed was the timeline. Trees do not grow on a political schedule. The southern yellow pine forests that supply much of America's domestic lumber require years of managed growth before a harvest cycle can meaningfully accelerate. The Pacific Northwest, which produces the Douglas fir and western hemlock that builders prefer for structural framing, operates under environmental regulations that limit how quickly production can expand. Many of the idle mills that tariff supporters expected to reopen had been shuttered not because of Canadian competition alone, but because of aging equipment, changing timber management policies, and workforces that had long since moved on. Here is what Washington never calculated. And it is the same mistake every empire makes when it confuses having resources with controlling a system. Tariffs did not remove dependency, they exposed it. Because when supply became more expensive, nothing replaced it. Not fast enough, not at scale, not without consequences. That is the difference between having resources and controlling a system. America has trees, Canada controls flow, and in modern systems, flow is power. The result was predictable in retrospect, though it took the market some time to fully price it in. Domestic production did not surge fast enough to offset the Canadian supply that tariffs had effectively priced out of reach. Lumber futures swung into territory that alarmed builders and developers who had constructed their project budgets on assumptions that no longer held. Contractors who had signed fixed-price agreements with clients found themselves underwater. Projects stalled, timelines stretched, and in the background, the housing inventory shortage that had already been squeezing American buyers for years grew worse rather than better. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that lumber price increases added tens of thousands of dollars to the cost of building a new single-family home. That estimate arrived before the most aggressive rounds of tariffs had even fully taken effect. The families who could least afford higher prices were the ones who felt the impact most directly. The entry-level market, where younger Americans and working families had traditionally found their foothold in homeownership, had already been eroding. Tariffs on Canadian lumber did not create that crisis. Yet they applied pressure to exactly the place where the system was already most fragile. There is a particular cruelty to that dynamic worth sitting with for a moment. Washington imposed costs on a supply chain it did not control, in service of an industrial revival it could not deliver quickly enough, and the bill landed on the buyers who had the least capacity to absorb it. That is not a description of strength. That is a description of a system reacting to a disruption it was not prepared to absorb. Rental markets felt it too. Developers who build apartment complexes operate on project economics that are sensitive to material costs. When lumber prices rise, the financial model for a new apartment building can shift from marginal profitability to clear loss. Projects get canceled, planned communities get shelved. Well, and the renters who needed those units found themselves competing for a supply that stopped growing at the moment the math stopped working. The knock-on effects of lumber tariffs reached into markets that had nothing visible to do with Canadian forests. The political promise embedded in the tariff announcement deserves examination as well. The claim that American sawmills would benefit, that domestic timber workers would see more jobs and better wages, had a foundation in economic logic. Protecting an industry from foreign competition does tend to support that industry in the short run. American lumber producers did see improved margins in the period following the tariff increases. Some mills did add shifts. Some workers did see more hours. That part of the story was real. What got less attention was the distribution of that benefit relative to the distribution of the cost. The American lumber producing industry employs roughly 100,000 workers across sawmills, logging operations, and related support roles. The American home building industry, and the broader construction sector that depends on lumber, employs closer to 8 million. When a policy benefits 100,000 workers at the expense of 8 million, the arithmetic of who wins and who loses is not ambiguous. It is simply politically inconvenient to state plainly, and so it often goes unstated. Meanwhile, Canada's response was neither panic nor passivity. Ottawa had been through this before. The softwood lumber dispute is one of the longest-running trade conflicts in North American history. But Canada had been winning this fight at international tribunals for decades. Washington kept losing, and Ottawa knew exactly how the next round would end. Canada did not fight the system, it rerouted it. A quiet but deliberate diversification of export markets began accelerating in ways that the lumber dispute did not create, but certainly deepened. Japan had long been a customer for Canadian softwood, particularly the dimension lumber used in traditional Japanese residential construction. That relationship deepened further. European markets, where sustainable forestry certification and grading standards aligned well with Canadian practices, began absorbing more Canadian products as trade routes shifted. China stepped forward as a buyer willing to purchase volumes that made the American market less indispensable than it had once appeared. Every shipment that stopped crossing into the United States did not disappear. It moved. And when it moved, so did leverage. That shift did not stay in lumber. It moved into power. Every container of Canadian softwood that sailed across the Pacific to a Chinese port rather than across the border to an American construction site represented a small but measurable transfer of economic control. Canada was not abandoning the American market. It remained the dominant destination for Canadian lumber. But the message embedded in that diversification was unmistakable. Ottawa had options. Washington had assumed it did not. Back inside the United States, the construction industry's frustration was growing louder. Home builders are not, as an industry, known for public confrontation with government policy. They operate in a world of permitting timelines, zoning approvals, and interest rate sensitivity that keeps their advocacy quiet and their political relationships careful. But the scale of the cost increases push that industry into open opposition. The argument that cut through the political noise with the most force was straightforward. Tariffs on Canadian lumber were functioning as a tax on American homebuyers. Every dollar added to the cost of imported lumber showed up in the price of a new home. And unlike a tax collected by the government and potentially recycled into public benefit, that cost went primarily to domestic lumber producers in the form of higher prices they could now charge because their foreign competition had been artificially made more expensive. There is also the question of what happens to American competitiveness in sectors that depend on affordable construction. Data centers require buildings. Manufacturing plants require buildings. Warehouses that support the supply chains Washington wanted to rebuild require buildings. When construction costs rise, the cost of all of those facilities rises with them. Companies planning capital investments in physical infrastructure have to adjust their financial models. Projects that made sense at one cost level stop making sense at another. The ripple moves outward from the lumberyard to the factory floor to the corporate planning spreadsheet, and at each stage it introduces more friction, more hesitation, more delay. The tariff meant to protect American industry quietly raised the cost of building the infrastructure that American industry needed. Prime Minister Mark Carney had already positioned his government around a theme of reducing strategic dependence on American markets and American decisions. The lumber dispute fed directly into that narrative. It provided concrete evidence, visible in housing prices and stalled construction projects, that Canadian resources could not be taken for granted, and that the United States would feel the consequences of attempting to do so. That evidence strengthened the political hand of those in Ottawa who argued for deeper investment in non-American trade relationships, in Pacific port infrastructure, in rail connections to new markets, and then in the trade agreements with Europe and Asia that had been quietly advancing while Washington focused elsewhere. The deeper consequence is not measured in lumber prices or housing starts alone. It is measured in how a relationship changes when one side discovers the limits of its leverage and the other side discovers the extent of its own. Canada entered this dispute as a supplier. It is leaving it as a gatekeeper, and the distinction matters enormously for what comes next. This is the same system failure that happens in defense procurement. A country that depends on another for its F-35 maintenance contracts, its rare earth minerals, its semiconductor supply, that country is not in control. It is inside a system someone else runs. Lumber made that visible because everyone can see a house. But the same logic applies to every critical supply chain a nation has quietly outsourced to a partner it assumed would always comply. The moment that partner stops complying, the dependency is no longer theoretical. It is a price on a contract, a stalled production line, a fighter jet sitting on a runway waiting for parts that require foreign approval to ship. The system does not care about the declaration that preceded it. It only responds to who actually controls the flow. This was never about lumber. It was about control over a system that most people never see. Who supplies it? Who replaces it? And what happens when access is restricted? Because once a country learns that it can shift its exports, and another country learns that it cannot replace them, the relationship changes. Quietly, permanently. And the next time Washington says it does not need something, the question will not be whether that is true. The question will be who actually controls the system behind it. If that question matters, subscribe, because this is just the beginning.